On behalf of our president, Jim DeMint, welcome to the Heritage Foundation. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Speaker Newt Gingrich, who will be discussing how to balance the budget. This is the third in a series of lectures he is giving over the coming weeks here at Heritage on understanding Trump and Trumpism. Unfortunately, I did not have the opportunity to work with the speaker when he was leading the Republican Revolution on Capitol Hill. By the time I arrived in the House of Representatives to begin my first job out of graduate school, the seismic shifts he set in motion had already reshaped the institutional and political landscape. But I have had the pleasure of teaching undergraduate and graduate students about the important and far-reaching changes that were made possible during that revolution as a result of his leadership. Plato tells us in his Republic that great leaders possess certain qualities. On one hand, they are intellects who have a readiness to learn and remember, quickness and keenness of mind, and the qualities that go with them, and enterprise and breadth of vision. On the other hand, they are steady, consistent characters on whom you can rely and who are unmoved by fear and war. Whether in the fight to get the Republican minority to shake off its complacency and reclaim the majority, or the effort to balance the budget in the 1990s, Speaker Gingrich has repeatedly elevated our horizon and focused our sights on greater possibilities. Equally important, he has had the courage and determination in each instance to lead Republicans in the arduous effort to realize those possibilities. This is no small thing. Too often in this town, leaders shrink from the fight when hardship and uncertainty loom in the minds of men. But as Plato tells us again, all great undertakings are risky, and as they say, what is worthwhile is always difficult. As we know, the challenges facing our nation today are great, and new leadership is needed to meet them. Fortunately, we are at a crossroads in our politics. This week, our republic, these United States of America, will inaugurate its 45th president. As Speaker Gingrich's experience has demonstrated, President-elect Trump can provide the leadership needed at this auspicious time if armed with conviction and resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest to the lectern, Speaker Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you all very much, and it is a rather exciting week. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out. And I think it's a remarkable achievement, as I've said before. Literally no person in American history has gone from never held public office and never served as a general officer in the military to being president. So this is an achievement literally without any precedent and sets the stage, I think, for a period that we'll all understand later by having lived through it. What I'm trying to do in this series of speeches is lay out a frame of reference to think about it, but I'm not suggesting that I have a prescription or a formula that inherently covers everything, because it's evolving, and I'll talk about that. You know, today I'm going to outline a Trumpian balanced budget, but first I want to thank Senator Jim DeMint and Ed Fulner, who's right over here, and the Heritage Foundation. We go back a long way. I used to go to, before I was even elected, I was going to lunches at Heritage, and one of the things I can report about conservatism is that the lunches have not actually changed since I. They are the same sandwiches. I think some days they are the same sandwiches, but that's different. But despite its culinary lack of adventure, Heritage was the decisive intellectual center in the Reagan administration's bold policy changes, producing over 2,200 recommendations in its 1,093-page report, Mandate for Leadership. And Heritage then had the courage 2 years later to come back and actually issue a report on Reagan. And the administration got about a 62 for having implemented Heritage's ideas. That is, however, the highest score any president's ever achieved. So, wow, it shows you how tough a grader Fulner was when he was the head of Heritage. In this transition, Heritage is once again playing a leadership role. These speeches are designed to reinforce the case for bold change. And these speeches are in the tradition of Heritage's vision statement, which is, quote, to build an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. Not a bad first step towards making America great again. This is the third in the series we're doing this month. We are preceded by a speech here at Heritage on the principles of Trump and Trumpism back on December 13th, and a speech at the National Defense University on the 14th of December on Trump and national security. Both of them are also available at the Heritage website and at the Gingrich Productions website. Now, in terms of the concept of balancing the budget, back in February 2016, Trump warned about excess spending and deficits at the MSNBC town hall meeting. He said, quote, "We can't keep doing this. We've got to start balancing budgets." On June 17th, 2016, then candidate Donald J. Trump told Sean Hannity he would insist on a balanced budget. He conceded that the Obama deficit is so big it would take a while, but said, quote, "I would absolutely insist on it relatively soon." Now, Trump's plans have been ridiculed by critics and so-called experts. In response, on September 26, 2016, economist Peter Navarro and entrepreneur Wilbur Ross released an analysis arguing that the Trump policies would lead to a bigger economy with greater revenue and less government spending. They argued Trump would, in fact, lead to a balanced budget over time. Navarro is now the Trump nominee to be director of a new National Council on Trade, and Wilbur Ross has been nominated to be Secretary of Commerce. There are two very different arguments about balancing the federal budget. The first is whether it is a stated goal, and the second is whether policies can be developed and implemented to actually make a balanced budget a reality. And I think part of what makes Trump and Trumpism so fascinating is, while it was a stated goal, it wasn't the central piece of the campaign. But the underlying patterns, I think, give us a very real chance to get there. You know, for candidate Trump, balancing the budget was never at the center. He said over and over he wanted to make America great again. He said he wanted to control our southern border and control immigration. He said he wanted to dramatically reshape our trade policies to favor America. He said he wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare. He said his domestic policy could be defined by three words: jobs, jobs, jobs. He said he wanted very bold tax reform to increase America's competitiveness and create jobs in America. He said he wanted bold deregulation to liberate Americans from bureaucrats and to renew the freedom for entrepreneurs and small businesses to create jobs. All of these policies help with shrinking the deficit and balancing the budget. My argument is that Trumpism produces a balanced budget largely as a consequence of its policies, rather than by focusing on the balance itself. It's actually a little parallel to Bill Walsh's book that he wrote when he was the coach of the 49ers, in which he said that the score is beside the point. His goal was not to focus on the score. It was to focus on the 49ers executing every play perfectly. And if they executed every play perfectly, the score would take care of itself. And in a sense, if the Trump policies are implemented, the consequence will be a balanced budget, even though that's not necessarily the primary goal. Now, for those who would write this analysis off as political propaganda, I want to take a detour to the 1990s and the only 4 balanced budgets of your lifetime. Now, I'm doing this deliberately because I recently have had some fairly stupid articles written critiquing my understanding of the complexities of the budget. Balancing the budget is a topic where most of my critics fit into Nassim Taleb's intellectuals yet idiots category. Those of you who've heard some of these speeches know that I'm a big fan of this, and I urge everybody to Google intellectual yet idiot, or IYI, which is Taleb's argument that there are an amazing number of people who are now significant people who can write essays and answer tests but don't know anything. And they do really well at writing essays and answer tests, so they get accepted to really fine universities where they study under professors who are really good at writing essays and answering tests, so they get really good grades, so they then get a job at the Supreme Court or the New York Times or in the bureaucracy where they get to write essays and answer tests, but they don't know anything. So they can write a brilliant essay on how you would change tires, but if you called and said, my car has a flat, they would not have a clue how to change it. And this explains a great deal of our policy problems at every single level. This is it's actually a very serious and subtle critique of, he estimates 40% of the governing class in the world are people who are articulate and glib and know nothing, which is very dangerous because they sound so sure of themselves that you're sure they must know something, and many of them have multiple degrees. I mean, if you work at it, you're going to have a Yale, Harvard, MIT set of degrees, and you just look at them and you think, my God, you must be smart. And they are smart. They just don't know anything. So they're intellectual yet idiot. Now, I think I can, and I'm going to try to clarify that I fit the opposite group. Okay. That is, I'm actually not an idiot. I'm also not an intellectual. But I did actually balance the budget. So having actually balanced the budget for 4 straight years, I'm willing to talk about balancing the budget, even though I'll be criticized in a variety of op-eds and columns by people who don't know anything, but who write really well. I mean, I must say that their ability to turn a phrase is remarkable, and if only they could combine that with knowledge, it would be really cool. Now, I was the leader of a House Republican team, and it's very important to understand this, and Trump's got to have the same attitude. Teams accomplish a lot. Arnaud Dupic, a French general, wrote in the mid-19th century, 4 strangers encounter a lion and the strangers will flee. 4 friends encounter a lion, they will kill the lion. And the same thing, teams can get things done. And individuals, no matter how powerful they are, in the long run can't sustain the momentum. So we had an amazing team because the truth was this was all done by sheer willpower. It was volitional. In the contract, we had promised to vote on the constitutional amendment, which we did. It passed the House decisively and came within 2 votes of passing the Senate. So we had 65 or 66 Senate votes, and we had about 309 House votes in favor of the balanced budget amendment. Now, we had a dinner one night in the Capitol with our leadership, including our key committee chairman, and we said, you know, we could now say we've done what we promised. We had the vote. Or we could say, gee, if you have 65 or 66 senators who claim to be for a balanced budget and over 300 House members who claim to be for a balanced budget, what if you just balance the budget? And we talked about it for about 3 hours. And Bill Archer, in particular, was then chairman of Ways and Means, turned to his chief of staff on the way out and said, you know, almost with tears in his eyes, we're actually going to do this. Because we decided we would go ahead and balance the budget, which was at the time seen as crazy, and you'll see why in a minute. The team included John Kasich as chairman of the Budget Committee, Bill Archer, chairman of Ways and Means, Bob Livingston at Appropriations, Tom Bliley at Energy and Commerce, and then the members of leadership like Dick Armey and Tom DeLay. And when we set out to balance the budget, the 4 previous years, the combined deficit was $1.017 trillion. So this was not, I mean, nobody in Washington thought you could balance the budget, just as nobody in Washington thought you could elect a Republican Congress. Starting in fiscal 1998, there were 4 years of surplus totaling $659 billion. So 4 years before us, we're borrowing $1 trillion. 4 years after our policy goes into effect, we're paying down $559 billion. That's how big the difference is. And in fact, there was a point where in 1999, Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve at that time, is publicly commenting on how they have to solve the intellectual problem. How would you manage the currency if there was no federal debt? Something we'd only achieved under Andrew Jackson. Now, the momentum of surpluses was so great that Jack Lew, then President Clinton's chief of staff, now Secretary of the Treasury, and Bob Rubin, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, wrote an op-ed in 1999. They praised the balanced budgets of the 1990s. And by the way, there's a great introduction by Al Gore. If you go through and pull up balanced budgets, and where Gore is taking total credit for how he and Clinton have balanced the federal budget. It was something he did shortly after inventing the internet. It was one of his many contributions to America. So the question is, how did we balance the budget? Particularly since nobody in Washington thought it was possible. But funny side story, by the way. We had said in the contract that we would bring up a constitutional amendment which said that the budget would be balanced within 7 years of passing the amendment. So we have this big dinner. We're all excited. 1 week later, we have a leadership meeting, and Kasich comes in very troubled because he's the guy who's the center of this. I mean, he's got to carry the ball for the whole team. He says, we've been looking at it. 7 years may be too short. he said, maybe we ought to go for 10. And we all talked about it. And he said, come on, guys, who said that balancing the budget in 7 years was written in stone? I mean, why don't we be practical? And we had a vote, and the vote was like 14-1. Kasich was the only guy who wanted to be practical. Because, of course, he's the guy who had to do it. The following week, we had a marble thing for his desk that said balanced budget 7 years, which we gave to him in a presentation in the leadership meeting, saying, you see, it is now written in stone. Now, I tell this story because I think the two most dangerous words for the Trump administration are reasonable and later. They're going to be surrounded by bureaucrats and reporters and people in the social cliques and lobbyists who say, you need to really be reasonable. We can work this out. That always means sell out. And their second term is, we really should do this later. Let's not rush into it, which always means never. So later means never, reasonable means never. And they need to understand that every single day when they're in the city. In fact, I would recommend to all of his cabinet and all of his senior officers at the sub-cabinet level that they all watch Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister to get a vivid sense of how the British senior civil service blocks elected officials from doing things that they're elected to do. They're marvelously well done. The person who produced them was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And you'll never see the bureaucracy the same if you watch Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. When we decided we would do this, we a little bit like the story I told the other day about the Woolman skating rink, where Trump says now that he's in charge, he realized he didn't know anything about fixing skating rinks. Once we decided we'd balance the budget, we realized this is a really big project. You're changing spending patterns by a couple $100 billion a year. And so the roundtable at that point was very, very helpful. And they would every Wednesday fly 12 to 15 CEOs in to have dinner with us in the Capitol. And we had the same conversation every week, and I would outline, we want to undertake a change in the government, in revenue and in spending combined, comparable to the size of General Motors or Walmart, annually. And we need your advice. You're a CEO. How would you think about this? And it was fascinating. We had probably 6 meetings like this. Every meeting had the same 3 principles, which again, I think the Trump team could find very useful. 1, set very big goals with very short time horizons. 2, delegate like crazy. You need a lot of people doing this. 3, kick all the experts out of the room. That every expert will slow you down and screw you up. And they kept over and over, we got this. So that was the model we followed. We also learned doing it, and Kasich really, I think, evolved remarkably in this period. You couldn't run over people. I mean, in a free society, in the House and Senate, everybody has power. And if you run over them, they may pretend they've given in, but they just knife you in the back later. So you've actually got to unlock them. We developed a model called Listen, Learn, Help, and Lead, where we would listen to people to find out what they really needed, try to learn from their situation and their problem, and try to help them, at which point they'd ask us to lead. And we were constantly trying to unlock people rather than run over people. And we developed this whole notion of, under what circumstance could you do this? And we practiced the idea of yes, if, rather than no, because. Don't tell me, no, we can't do that because. Tell me, yes, we could do it if. And you can say exactly the same thing in the next part of the sentence. So you can put the burden on me of solving it. But the difference psychologically from meetings that start with no, because, or yes, if is astonishing. At least 10 times as productive to say yes, if. So we're going through this. This was a very intense multi-month process in which virtually every member of the House Republican Party was engaged, because to really change the federal government, you have to really dramatically move things. And we had 2 core assumptions. If you accelerated economic growth, revenue would rise, and if you controlled spending over time, it would go down. Very simple model. Applying it was complicated. The capital gains tax cut was one of the big keys. This is the largest capital gains tax cut in history. It was done very specifically to accelerate investment. It worked dramatically. We got much better reaction, many times bigger than the Joint Tax Committee thought we'd get. and because people responded to it. The two things that were going on that really changed the business environment were the capital gains tax cut, which was a signal we wanted people to invest and save in America, and the deregulation process that Dick Armey led, because that sent a signal there's going to be less red tape, less harassment. We were not going to be nearly as tolerant of bureaucrats running over you. And so particularly small businesses were responding to the deregulatory process very dramatically. And the combination of the tax cut and the deregulatory policy really dramatically increased revenues. At the same time, we were controlling spending. The most powerful was welfare reform. And again, I mean, I think because this is a country with enormous talent outside Washington, something which I hope the Trump team will actually pick up on, we were helped because particularly Tommy Thompson and John Engler and then George Allen and Mike Levitt had all experimented with welfare reform. So they were prepared to actually loan us their welfare directors, something which, frankly, the federal staff in Washington did not like. I mean, you go to the Energy and Commerce staff or the Ways and Means staff and say, hi, you get some new playmates who are state-level people who actually run welfare programs, who actually do the work. Again, instinctively the opposite of intellectual yet idiot. We wanted people who had their hands dirty, who'd been running programs, who had dealt with trying to help the poor. The result was we produced a welfare reform bill that's probably the most successful social conservative reform of the last half century. Welfare offices became employment offices. Instead of counseling people on how to be dependent, we counsel people on how to get jobs. We took the great lessons learned by a firm in New York called America Works, which is the most successful long-term welfare recipient program of training them and getting them into work. And they don't get paid unless they stay on the job for at least 6 months. So it's a really challenging program. But we took all of these things, put them into a program, decentralized it back to the states, allowed them to experiment, had a dramatic decline in the number of people on welfare, a rise in income as people went to work, and the largest decline in children in poverty in American history. So, I mean, people on the left just go crazy because none of this can be true. You know, this had to be hurting the poor. Well, no, actually, they got jobs, their incomes went up, and their children came out of poverty, which means that work actually is superior. We also had Medicare reform, which was our most challenging thing. We knew you could not balance the federal budget unless you reformed Medicare. We also knew Medicare was on the verge of going broke. And so we went through a very complicated reform process. We worked very closely with AARP because we had figured out, we're doing this in 1996 during a presidential campaign, and we figured out we'd get killed if AARP said we were anti-senior citizen. And so we worked for a year to get the AARP national leadership. Now, the Washington Policy Office remained socialist and left-wing and favoring Bernie Sanders. But the political offices, the people who got elected from back home, the people who ran the actual AARP system, all decided that what we were trying to do was real and correct, and they actually sided with us against the Clinton White House. And so we were able to pull off. Now, we did one other thing that, again, is part of this style of real change. We went and had Dan Miller, a congressman from Florida, spend a year training members into how to talk. Because we were going to increase spending on Medicare, but increase it at a lower rate. The left would then describe that as a cut. Well, it wasn't a cut. It was an increase. It was a smaller increase, but it was an increase. And it was really important to get people trained to go back home and win the argument in town hall meetings or on television or in newspaper editorial boards. Because we did all that, we actually pulled off Medicare reform during a presidential year. That was a key component of the building blocks of getting to a balanced budget. We also had communications reform, which dramatically liberated the communications industry to modernize and to develop the systems we use today. We had FDA reform, a program which Congressman Joe Barton had actually worked on in the minority and laid the base for, knew what he was doing, so we could pass it pretty rapidly. We did have, and this always surprises people, we didn't just cut spending across the board. We had very selective increases. Two examples. We doubled the budget for the National Institutes of Health because I'm a passionate believer that in the long run, unless you get the medical research to dramatically break through, you're never going to control spending. I mean, if you continue to have Alzheimer's rising, you continue to have other diseases like that rising, you'll just never control it. You can't do enough bureaucratic things. if you have an aging population with a dramatic increase in some diseases. So medical research, in my mind, is the most important long-term conservative commitment to getting to a long-term balanced budget. And to give you one example, Alzheimer's by itself, from now to 2050, in public and private spending, is about $20 trillion, the entire current national debt. So you have to find breakthroughs. The second, we should have actually increased the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation. It was a mistake that we didn't, because a lot of the basic techniques that are used at NIH come out of the NSF. The other place we increased spending was in the intelligence community, and I have to confess I was pleased when the 9/11 Commission singled it out and talked about it as the Gingrich plus-up, and said that it happened against the Clinton administration's deep opposition, and that it was the money that was essential to preserving the capacity of the intelligence community. Those were the biggest fights, but we were trying to be selective. Places that ought to go up, we tried to get more money for while we were controlling spending overall. All of that activity strengthened the dollar and allowed for lower interest rates. The practical result was people were doing dramatically better. We followed the principle that a job is the best social policy, or as Ronald Reagan put it, the best welfare is a paycheck every 2 weeks. Even liberals were stunned by the success of balancing the budget for 4 straight years and creating jobs. This is what, in the article I mentioned earlier by Lou and Rubin, this is what they wrote, quote, the president's plan, I've always loved this, the president's plan to retire such a large amount of debt is also the best pro-growth strategy for our economy. This is a February 1999 commentary in the Washington Post. Quote, when the government adds to private savings rather than drawing from it, more resources are available for private economic growth, higher standards of living, and increased revenues, without any increase in tax rates. They called high deficits a straitjacket on investment and economic growth, saying that the deficit reduction achieved by Clinton and the Republican Congress led to economic growth. So later on, since Lou presided over the Obama deficits, one wonders whether he lost his belief in balanced budgets. But it was interesting that even by 1999, you began to have liberals saying, this is working, it's increasing economic growth, it's increasing take-home pay, it's increasing opportunity for the poor. And so I would argue that it's important to recognize that we have, and this is my key argument with all those people who are going to write these critical articles, we've balanced the budget in modern times. It's not a theory. It's a historic fact. We do know how to do this because we've done it. Furthermore, not only can we balance the budget, I think there's a moral case for doing it and a practical case. Morally, outside war and emergencies, it's simply wrong for us to spend our children's money. You know, we used to be a country in which people worked and saved to pay off the mortgage and leave kids the farm. We've become a country in which people borrow and sell off the farm in order to mortgage the future. It's fundamentally wrong. And we need to understand that in many ways balancing the budget is a moral, not an economic issue. Ultimately, the recent pro-debt, pro-spending model collapses. Margaret Thatcher captured it best when she said, the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money to spend. Our lack of discipline has created an absurd student loan crisis caused by absurd policies. I mean, if you went back and looked at the last 20 years and said, we're going to create a Ponzi scheme in which we're going to encourage students to spend longer periods in college by borrowing the money so they don't feel the effect of wasting their time until later when they graduate and are now asked to repay the money, which they will now deeply resent because they've already spent it. At the same time, by setting up this kind of a debt scheme, we're going to encourage the universities to raise their tuition because it's all free money. So if you go back and look at the last 20 or 25 years as simply a Ponzi scheme in education, it all becomes very obvious. Now, by contrast, I urge everybody to look at President Jerry Davis and the College of the Ozarks. College of the Ozarks is a work-study college. You cannot get in unless you need federal aid. They have no federal aid. So you work. You work 20 hours a week during the school year, 40 hours a week during the summer. That pays your total cost. 92% of the students graduate from the College of the Ozarks with zero debt. The 8% who have a debt bought a car their senior year. Okay? And it actually creates a real fundraising problem for them, although they've done remarkably well building an endowment. But their fundraising problem is historically, people give to a college they want their kids to go to. Well, the alumni, by definition, are now doing well enough. Their kids aren't eligible to go to the College of the Ozarks because they're earning too much money. And so it's a very interesting conundrum. But I think one of the most interesting people culturally and educationally in America is President Jerry Davis. And I just recommend that because I've tried unsuccessfully now for a decade to get states to create at least one work-study college in the poorest part of every state. So you could go out and say to kids, no, you don't have to be in debt. I mean, the first answer to kids is don't borrow the money. You know, and I'm hoping that Betsy DeVos will have the courage. She's going to be a great leader. She's going to be a great Secretary of Education. You can tell how big a threat she is to the teachers' union by the degree to which they're already rabid. But the fact is, she represents dramatic change. And I hope she'll have the courage to say, you know, the truth is we shouldn't encourage students to borrow money. We should encourage them to work. We should encourage them to save. We should encourage them to focus. When you go to student debt, it takes longer to get out of school. You also have schools that only offer the courses every other year that you have to have. Well, that's absurdly destructive behavior, and we shouldn't tolerate it. But it's behavior built around one thing. Can we optimize the life of the faculty? It has nothing to do with students. Just as, by the way, big city schools have nothing to do with students. Big city schools are remarkably successful engines of paying teachers, and they do it very well. They're close to 100%. They just don't teach, but that's a different issue. So, our current policies have destroyed hope, trapped people in dependency, created a crisis of disabilities with Medicaid cards. I encourage everybody to read Quinones' book, Dreamland, which is a study of the opioid epidemic, the heroin epidemic, which parallels it, the collapse of small-town America, the degree to which people get on disabilities for the purpose of getting a Medicaid card so they can find 3 or 4 corrupt doctors so they can then get drugs charged to their Medicaid card. I mean, this whole process, if we understood how much we have subsidized the crisis in opioid addiction through taxpayer dollars, we would be in a rage. I mean, these are systems of really deep destruction. They're compounded by liberals who sneer at hamburger flipping jobs. You know, I just want to make an old-fashioned case here. Work is good. The first stage of learning how to work requires showing up. Any job beats no job. The older you are when you get your first job, the harder it is to learn certain key lessons. Being on time, staying the whole time, paying attention. Think about a math class where you can get through and get a passing degree with 70%, and the first time you make change, working at a McDonald's or a Wendy's or whatever, and they actually expect you to be at 100%. I mean, if you said at the end of your first day of work, hey, my cash register is 70% accurate. And this again goes back to intellectual yet idiot. I mean, what kind of system would believe that it isn't useful to learn about that the real world expects 100%? Over and over again. You know, I was nice to 70% of the customers. Why are you mad at me? So these are things which have created dependency, and dependency is proven to be a dream-killing dead end leading to drug addiction, violence, and passivity. Just as the unionized public bureaucracies have expensively reinforced those failures by leaving poor children with inadequate skills to get jobs. Trumpism can lead to a balanced budget by the consequences of its policies. If they have the courage to avoid screams of responsibility and screams of waiting till later, they can have an enormous impact. I think that the team of winners that he has assembled are so successful and so powerful that their collective will, if they focus it, will in fact change the city in dramatic ways. I think the election of Trump is a psychological watershed which makes many things possible which were impossible on November 7th. This is my key argument with all of the intellectual news media analyst types. They're all still in the old world, reinterpreting Trumpism back into the world they're used to. And it's profoundly wrong. Trying to measure the post-Trump victory world by the standard and formulas of the pre-Trump world is comparable to the pollsters who simply could not believe the shape of the 2016 electorate until it actually voted. Remember, even on election day, the pollsters were distorting the exit polls to get the outcomes they wanted. And that's what you're seeing with all these policy analysts. I've lived through 3 watersheds in conservative politics. Goldwater, whose nomination shattered the moderate wing of the party, which had controlled the party up to then, and was unthinkable in 1962, and by the time he got control of the party's machinery in 1964, had decisively begun to change the shape of the Republican Party and the shape of American politics. Reagan, who on 3 different topics, the future of the Soviet Union, the nature of economic growth, and the importance of American civic culture and American history. On those 3 topics, he was a revolution from Jimmy Carter. I mean, you cannot imagine the world of Ronald Reagan in the summer of 1981 as compared to the world it would have been under Carter. And I always remind people this. What we're going to see on Friday, just close your eyes and say, it's Hillary Clinton being sworn in. It's Hillary Clinton's cabinet being announced for the last 3 weeks. That's the gap we're describing. And nobody in the intellectual system in Washington has really come to grips with. This is the gap. This was the world they thought they would have. This is the world they're getting. It's that big a gap. I will also say to all of my conservative friends that when on occasion President-elect Trump and then President Trump does something which I find wrong, irritating, or whatever, all I have to do is close my eyes and think President Hillary Clinton. And for at least the next 2 years, I will forgive him virtually anything because it is so much less than she would have done on the very first day. Now, I've also been through the revolution of 1994. Prior to 1994, Republicans had held the House for 4 years out of 68. Had not held the House for 40 years. Since 1994, we've held the House for 20 years, and the Democrats have held the House for 4 years. And the odds are pretty good now we'll hold the House for at least another decade. Pelosi today, I say this with great pride, Pelosi today has spent more time in the minority as a leader than any modern House Democrat. And it just makes me feel warm all over. Now, let me give you 3 other watershed examples that are outside of politics, but have political implication. 1829, the first railroad engine, Stephenson's The Rocket, is built in Britain. 1831, the first railroad engine arrives in Baltimore. 1832, a young 23-year-old candidate for the state legislature in Illinois runs with a pamphlet which includes building a railroad. His name is Abraham Lincoln. He's never seen a train. He's read about a train. He's figured out that given the great prairie of Illinois, having a train would be helpful to farmers. And so he's campaigning as a pro-railroad legislator, not having ever seen one. In the 1850s, he becomes a very successful, very famous railroad lawyer, wins a very key case involving whether or not railroad bridges are obstructions to paddle boats, because there was a paddle boat which hit a bridge, and the paddle boat company sued, a steamship company sued, and Lincoln proved that the captain of the ship was drunk, and that actually you had to be utterly stupid to have hit the bridge. Very important decision, because the steamship companies were hoping to knock down all the bridges. Lincoln then is the only president in the United States to have a patent, and it was a patent for turning ships right side. So he's always interested in technology. 1859, he goes to Council Bluffs, looks across the Missouri River and says, we need a transcontinental railroad. 10 years later, we open it. I just give you all that framework. Here's a guy who's totally in tune. Remember, he rides around Illinois to the Lincoln-Douglas debates on a train. I mean, he's totally in tune with the technology of his generation. The second great breakthrough I want to mention is Edison's electric light. I mean, if you're out somewhere using candles and whale oil and somebody comes along and says, you're going to have this dramatically better light with no smoke, it's like magic. I mean, it's hard for us to remember just how much these things were magic. Third is the Wright brothers. I mean, the first time people started talking about flying, it was almost like a joke. The Wright brothers fly in December 17, 1903. The first time a large number of people see them is 1907. Now, in 1903, when they first flew, they flew a distance shorter than the wingspan of a Boeing 747. Within 4 years, they've so improved the airplane that they fly around the island of Manhattan and 1.5 million people see it. Well, if you're designing a world for airplanes while you're still riding in a stagecoach, that's a real watershed event. And I think it's very important to get this in mind because almost none of our current analysts can imagine that we're going through a watershed. They don't understand the concept, they don't pay attention to it, they don't think about it. But if Trump is in fact successful, and that's still an open question, I mean, he has an enormous fight ahead of him. But if he is in fact successful, this will be, November 8th will have been a watershed truly comparable to Andrew Jackson or to Ronald Reagan or to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, if you assume that the cabinet of winners and their advisors and supporters across the country stay committed to imposing, and I want this again, important concept, imposing change. This is not a city that's going to turn around and say, please change us. Despite the establishment opposition and hostility, the ridicule of the media, the contemptuous lectures of the academic left, and the entrenched, embittered, and often dishonest opposition of left-wing bureaucrats seeking to defend their careers and their ideology from being dismantled. Specific example. I was asked on Face the Nation on Sunday about shouldn't Trump find a way to cozy up to the intelligence community? And my answer was no. That his instruction to Dan Coats as the new director of national intelligence should be to thoroughly, totally overhaul the community. Now, I'll give you 3 examples. One, what the political appointees, remember they talk about the community, baloney. A couple of political appointees outrageously violated the system. Outrageously. Should all have been compelled to resign. So I don't want to be told that the head of the CIA, who is a Clinton appointee, who's a left-winger, and who I totally distrust, is somebody I have to be friends with. I think what they did was despicable and discredits the entire process of intelligence. Second, they did the same thing on Benghazi. It was the acting head of the CIA who approved of the changes that were lies. Third, Senator McCain correctly passes on a report he had been given, and the community has months to decide whether or not this report's accurate. They take the report without having checked it, put it as an addendum to a report they're giving the president and the president-elect, knowing it'll be leaked, of course. And it says that Trump may have been colluding with the Russians. And they have a key piece of evidence in the report. One of Trump's staff may have been in Prague meeting with Russians. Now, I have to tell you, as a historian, as a Speaker of the House, as somebody who was one of the Committee of 8 who supervised intelligence, as somebody who's worked with the CIA for years and the NSA, I was furious. This is a level of incompetence that third graders would be, you'd say to the third graders, did you check? I mean, if a third grader came running in the door and said, there was a dragon outside. This is the equivalent. I mean, nobody in Washington yet has gotten, I mean, I'm really angry about it, and I really hope both the House and Senate committees are going to be, I don't just want to be serious about Russian hacking. I want to be serious about American incompetence. Because guess what? It turned out when you called the guy, he'd never been in the Czech Republic. Now, this is tricky. Back to IYI and intellectual yet idiot. If you have never been in the Czech Republic, you can't have been in Prague. I mean, I know, this is why I get in trouble. Big ideas, big themes. It's factually impossible. And when I hear, and I've known Jim Clapper for years, and I think in parts of his career he's done great things for America. But when I hear him explain that not a single person picked up the phone to call this guy, I just want to cry. This is a level of incompetence worthy of a Peter Sellers movie. But it's not worthy of the United States of America. So when we're told that Trump has to get along with these bureaucracies, my first answer is no. I want him to change the bureaucracies, not get along with them. And if he's going to change the bureaucracies, which are filled with people who gave money to Clinton, filled with people who voted for Clinton, filled with people who have total contempt for Trump, why would you pretend that they are a neutral civil service? They are the other team paid for by the taxpayers. And I think it's going to require a great deal of courage and a great deal of endurance to go through it. But if they go all out, the consequences of their policies could easily lead to a balanced budget. Just consider a few bold changes. As Jim Frog wrote in his book, Stop Paying the Crooks, if they simply brought in American Express, Visa, and MasterCard to replace the CMS bureaucracy on payments, you save somewhere between $110 and $120 billion a year. So we'll round down, to be cautious, $1 trillion over a decade. Not big money, that's on Medicare and Medicaid alone. If you applied the same technology to disabilities and to food stamps, you again save billions of dollars a year. Not as much as you do with Medicare and Medicaid. But if you applied it also to the VA and to TRICARE, again, you get these changes that are dramatic. If you stop the GSA right now from building a whole series of new buildings, again, Trump is a great contractor, he understands this, there is zero reason for any program which was designed before November 8th to automatically go forward. Zero. Every program that was designed before November 8th should be rigorously scrutinized by the Trump team to decide, is it necessary? Is it too big? Can it be done less expensively? Is there an alternative? I mean, all of these things, I think, are serious questions, and GSA is just out of control. They have 3 or 4 building projects that combine to be well over $1 billion. I mean, I think it's $3 or $4 billion now in their wish list that they're going to rush forward. And of course, like good bureaucracies, they want to rush forward faster than the new civilian leaders who've been elected can stop them. And so they ought to put a stop on all of it till they get through it. If we shift from a regulatory system based on inputs to a regulatory system based on outputs and liberate people to achieve the goals and with their own creativity and their own effort, we dramatically reduce cost. We dramatically move power out of Washington, and Philip Howard has done remarkable work on that. If we reverse Obama's war on private sector education options and immediately eliminate the gainful employment rule, the current bureaucratic war on private education costs billions to taxpayers while cutting off people from learning for better jobs. This has been one of those hidden zones where the bureaucracy in the Department of Education has methodically gone out to destroy private sector, trade schools, and education for people, and has done so in a way where when they destroy one of the schools, they then use taxpayers' money to pay off the students' debt, not to help the students go get educated. So they try to maximize the cost, so they build this propaganda war. I've gotten involved in it. It is astonishing how hostile and how much like a totalitarian system they have become in this particular zone where they just hate the idea of a for-profit school. It's ideological and it's deep, and they have been very effective at it. On Obamacare, and it's something which Tom Price knows very, very well, they need to liberate patients and doctors from red tape to enable them to be honest about cost options. And by the way, Price is one of the people who will be the most attacked because, along with Betsy DeVos, he represents a direct threat to the system of the left. I think we should insist on health information technology being interoperable to save lives and reduce cost. It is astonishing to me. You have 2 or 3 very, very large corporations whose deliberate strategy is to put into hospitals IT programs that do not talk to anybody else. And this is their corporate strategy. And it is absolutely something we ought to be having hearings on, and we ought to bring the CEOs in and ask them to explain why in the national interest would we tolerate paying for this kind of activity. Because it literally, you can have 2 hospitals side by side using the same company, and the company will not make the hospitals interoperable. Now, the hospitals are also guilty, because the hospitals want to make it hard for the doctors to change hospitals. But all of this is against the public interest. I mean, this is the sort of thing that led AT&T, frankly, to be dramatically changed right after the turn of the century, in the last century, because there were 2,500 small telephone companies, and AT&T wouldn't connect to them. And gradually the country said, this is crazy. We're not going to, you can't do this. Well, we're in the same place right now. We could almost overnight dramatically improve health care, improve interoperability, make life easier for doctors and patients if we could get that solved. Again, we need to create a public-private partnership for Mars, the moon, industrial space, and tourism. We can get there faster, at lower cost, better, if we profoundly redesign NASA So it is a public-private partnership cooperating with people like Elon Musk. We have a whole bunch, this is a weird development of the modern world. We have a whole bunch of billionaires who are space freaks. And they're all willing to put up money. And my view is if I could find a couple billionaires who are willing to risk their own money, I would much rather have them take the risk because they'll do it faster, more aggressively, and they'll fail some. Remember I said the other day in my speech, the Wright brothers failed 500 times before they could fly. You'll never get that with the government bureaucracy. I mean, the studies alone guarantee they couldn't do 500 experiments in your lifetime. But if you're out here letting them fail and try again and fail and try again, you make progress really fast if you're actually doing things as opposed to studying them. We need to reform the Food and Drug Administration to move science from the laboratory to your medicine cabinet as rapidly as possible. And particularly if you have a fatal disease. This idea, we're going to protect you on safety when you have a disease you're going to die from in 18 months, strikes me. There ought to be some kind of informed consent you're allowed to sign. But there are a whole range of ways in which the FDA bureaucracy now is a major impediment to getting things to the public as fast as possible. We ought to overhaul the Pentagon to dramatically reduce red tape and reduce acquisition time and cost, and we ought to shift from civilian employees to fighting. It's amazing under Obama, the number of people in uniform has gone down, the number of people in civilian jobs who can be unionized has gone up. And that's the nature of the current Pentagon is totally imbalanced away from the professional military. We need to substantially overhaul the intelligence community and really look at things like, do you really want a director of national intelligence with, I think, 700 or 900 staff, in addition to having 17 intelligence agencies? I mean, somewhere in there, the picture makes no sense. We need to create a regulatory complaint and review process. What I would like to figure out how we could do with every member of the House and Senate, with every state legislator, every governor, and every cabinet officer is develop essentially crowdsourcing, where people could identify the red tape they find stupidest. And you know, whether you're a small business or you're a local community or you're a school board, I mean, so everybody could pile on in helping us figure out how to intelligently get rid of red tape and replace the most destructive and expensive regulations. All of that will accelerate economic growth. The estimate today is that universities spend 10 to 15% of their overhead just filling out federal forms. Well, which of those federal forms really matter and which of those federal forms are just paper? And so there are a whole series of those things. This is a minor thing, but symbolically it's not. And I'll be curious to see how Trump reacts to it. We ought to cut dramatically the cost of White House travel. If you look at the total cost of the Obama vacations, they're really kind of astonishing. I mean, we have been drifting steadily now towards a monarchical vision of the presidency, in which everything gets bigger, more bloated, more surrounded, and we really ought to reverse that and ask ourselves in very practical terms, you know, does the vice president really need to be treated as though they were the president, while the president's being treated as though they're an emperor? The growth of who has to go on the trips, you know, all this stuff, it seems like small stuff, but literally go back and look at, Eisenhower had, I believe, 40 people in the National Security Council. I think it's over 400 now. You know, there's just a general gigantism. It's perfectly natural. Parkinson wrote about it. It's the natural growth of bureaucracy. We should change the trade laws to rebuild American industries, create American jobs, and increase the American tax base. We should liberate federal lands for energy and minerals and other development reflecting the original sense of America as a land of opportunity. We need to protect the national parks. There are some wilderness areas we need to protect. I'm totally in favor of that. I taught environmental studies. I taught in the Second Earth Day. But do we really have to have the federal government own 82% of Nevada? I mean, now, if you're the Sierra Club, all 82% is precious, and somewhere in that 82% is a species we haven't found, which might be lost if we, in fact, developed it. So therefore, in order to avoid stopping any species, we should develop nothing. But 82%? It's astonishing. I think in Rhode Island we have 5,000 acres, for example, in the whole state. It's the state where we have the least federal land. Because in the east, you didn't have this huge federal government. And as we went west, we just kept absorbing the land. And places that weren't good for homesteading, nobody occupied them until the Sierra Club came along. And now they're supposedly, you know, they're automatically sacred. So just take one state, Nevada. Aren't there some areas of Nevada we could develop out of 82% of the state? And I'll let you decide whether it's half of it, you know, 41% or 10%, but as a theoretical model. Can we really make with a straight face the argument that virtually all of Nevada has to be federal land and untouchable? Now, these policy changes I've just outlined in terms of federal lands would generate more than $200 billion a year, or over $1 trillion in a decade. Finally, jobs could easily produce 5% real growth, which would dramatically increase federal revenue. That's not the peak of the Reagan growth, but 5%, in my mind, and I've been told by various people in the administration and the new administration, don't get too big a number. Well, I think they should be going in the opposite direction. What's the optimum growth rate we could achieve over the next decade to put the maximum number of Americans to work, to increase participation rates in the economy and increase take-home pay? You know, for example, a 5% one-time repatriation tax for the over $2 trillion in profits that are locked up overseas would both yield $100 billion in revenue and would increase the total investment in the United States massively. No, I mean, these are the kind of things that are real game changers. The revenue from that alone would move us toward a more balanced budget. We need a program to move from disabilities to capabilities. If you look at the Wounded Warrior projects and you look at what people are capable of doing, then you have to really rethink a lot of what we currently accept as disabilities and ask, why aren't we exploring how those people could be capable of leading full lives, rather than how we keep them locked in dependency because of a particular diagnosis. School choice will move young people from more expensive, bureaucratic, unionized schools that are failing to less expensive schools with higher rates of success. On almost every front, the current bureaucracies are so inefficient and so out of touch with 21st century capabilities, and the policies are so anti-work and saving and learning and anti-competitiveness that the potential is enormous for a less expensive federal government, leading to a dramatically bigger American economy with far higher incomes. And I'll just close with one last example. There's a firm called ZocDoc. ZocDoc was created with the understanding that the average doctor has every fourth appointment canceled. So they have empty space every day. Patients have a very hard time finding a new doctor. So they created a switching system, basically dating. A switching system where you put in your zip code and which of 40-some specialties you need. They then find out which doctor just had a cancellation. And they get the average person to a doctor in one day. The doctor makes money out of time that would have been lost. The patient's happy because they got to a doctor. They make the transaction fee of linking the two up. They make about the same number of reservations as the Veterans Administration, around 5 million. They have 400 people. Veterans Administration has well over 1,000 computer programmers, and I think they have 23,000 people in the reservation department. And they fail. That's one of the great areas of scandal. So just take those two models and ask yourself, what is the potential savings if we bring government into the 21st century? And I think you get to a balanced budget. But it's the consequence of the change, not the goal. Can I just toss it open for questions now? So we have people here with microphones. Yes, sir. Wait, let's see, where are the microphone people? Okay, this guy right over here. And then we'll come to you in the back.
I'm Don Cook. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I spent 33 years with the State Department, so I understand what the problem is very well. One of the responses of previous administrations to try to get control of the bureaucracy is this National Security Council staff, which has 400 people as opposed to 40 people. And is the Trump administration going to try to create a parallel system that works and forces the bureaucracy to its will, or does it try to reform the bureaucracy and make the bureaucracy full of Clinton supporters and Democratic donors responsive to the leadership?
Well, I hope they're going to argue, I don't know, but I hope they're going to argue for very dramatic reform of the civil service system so that we actually can regain control over the bureaucracies.
This goes with
and by the way, this is a very old problem. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt so distrusted the State Department that he assigned people directly to Eisenhower reporting back to him when Eisenhower was in North Africa because he didn't trust him. Jim Baker once told a friend of mine who was an ambassador, if you have something to tell me, call me direct because there are only 7 people in the building I trust. That's when he was Secretary of State.
I was there.
Okay, yeah, all right. The gentleman right back there. Go ahead, she's going to give you that. Okay.
Thank you very much. Rahim Rashidi from Kurdistan TV. What will be differences between President Obama and President Trump for the Kurds? And what is your advice for the new administration to support Kurdistan and Peshmerga? Thank you.
Well, my guess is you're going to find that General Mattis has always been very favorable to Peshmerga and to the Kurds, and that he is going to bring that experience into his job as Secretary of Defense, and that'll be a significant part of shaping this. I mean, again, I think Trump will be very much more favorable to America's allies than Obama has been. Obama basically has been terrific if you're our opponent, but he's not been very positive if you're our allies. So, yes, sir. This guy right here, and then we're going to go back up to the far.
Carl Gollivan. Question concerning budget balancing. Is it possible really to balance a budget where we use an inflating IOU borrowed into existence at usury as our monetary unit? Of course, you point out Jackson balanced the budget. He also ended any federal debt because he required we use an honest constitutional monetary unit. But can we do that without really entering into a new Bretton Woods agreement to bring a global circulating gold monetary unit?
Well, I mean, the way you've linked it, the answer is yes. Of course, you can balance the federal budget while still having fiat currency. It's
but
been
it's
done
an
before.
illusion because the federal deficit debt is actually how many trillions of dollars that we're making no progress at paying off.
Well,
that.
if you balance the budget for real, you gradually start paying it down. You create a sinking fund and create it down. The British did it in the 19th century. We did it after the Civil War, so it's doable.
Okay,
Okay,
just to
yes,
digress.
yes, ma'am. The lady right there.
Hi, I'm Catherine Sirks from Doctor Patient Medical Association, and also I am co-chair of Women for Trump, National Women for Trump. I have begrudgingly been invited to speak at the Women's March on Saturday, and I'm used to facing hostile audiences because I've been out talking about Women for Trump for the last 8 months. I want to know if you think I should skip it or if I should go, and what would you say should be my focus on the message?
Well, I mean, my experience is, again, I don't know how much time you'll have, which is a part of this. You have 4 minutes?
I'm willing.
Yeah, but what I would say is really simple. People have the right to decide that they want to spend the next 8 years screaming no, or they can decide that they actually want to figure out positive things we can do together. Mattis described it when he went into Iraq. He said, the Marines can be your best friend or your worst enemy, and you get to choose. And I think we ought to say, Trump, I would start by saying, as you may have noticed yesterday, Trump is now president, Pence is now vice president, and everybody in this audience has two choices. Do you want to spend the next 8 years productively trying to find ways to work together, or do you want to find 8 years to practice screaming no? And that's your right as an American. And for those of you who want to scream no, that's terrific. I don't have anything to say to you because I don't want to scream no. For those of you who'd like to work together, let's get together and talk about what we can get done in a positive way. And there are lots of things we can do together. I mean, one example where Trump will probably be very aggressive is the whole issue of child trafficking. And the whole question of the number, about 800,000 women a year sold into slavery. Well, that's a topic we actually could be on common ground. Yeah. Over here, this lady right down here.
Thank you. I'm a reporter with Shenzhen Media Group. So last Friday, Mr. Trump said that the one China policy is negotiable, but a few of his key cabinet picks, including Mr. Rex Tillerson and James Mattis, both said in the confirmation hearings that they see no plans to alter the one China policy. So who will Mr. Trump listen to on this issue, and what do you think will happen to one China policy after he takes office? Thank you.
I suspect they'll have to coordinate their communications. Look, but I also think they're answering different questions. I don't think there's any current plan to change the one China policy, so you can say that correctly. On the other hand, Trump is trying to set up a negotiation with Beijing, and Trump is sending a signal to Beijing that if you really want everything to be on the table, remember what everything is. And don't come and tell us we have to give you everything you want, well, you give us nothing we want, and don't come and tell us you're going to keep stealing $460 billion a year of intellectual property, as the Director of National Intelligence Staff reported last spring, but we're supposed to be passive. And don't come and tell us you're going to build islands in the middle of the South China Sea to create a sovereign right over the entire South China Sea. But we're supposed to be passive. I think that means, so Trump's trying to set up a negotiating strategy that opens up a range of options and also tries to convince the Chinese government that this is not the America they're used to dealing with. You know, that this is an America which is going to raise a lot of issues. I mean, we'd like the Chinese, for example, to actually keep the word they gave 20 years ago about Hong Kong, where they have been gradually, steadily breaking up the idea that you could have, you know, two systems in one China. Remember that one? Well, it's rapidly becoming one system in one China led by Beijing. That's an absolute violation of the agreement they made over 20 years ago. So I think, you know, I think it's all right for us to be very, very direct. Yes, sir. He's coming down right now.
My name is Ryan Curran. I have a question about, as far as you used the term intelligent idiots a couple times. I think as far as the opiate epidemic goes, because of the stigma that goes along with the people that are in recovery, often the people that have been in the trenches of addiction that understand it and know how to get out are often not questioned enough. Is that a field that you think, as far as balancing the budget, that you'll actually be able to help Trump or even yourself understand more what the addicts go through and how you can use them constructively to help you guys, you know, form an actual solution rather than just, you know, viewing this as a policy?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what Taleb meant by intellectual yet idiot, actually talking with people who have been addicted and are recovering addicts would make sense, because those are people who actually have experienced the thing they're telling you about. Talking to the sociology professor who has never dealt with addicts, doesn't know anything about addicts, but wrote 3 papers on addiction based on having once read a Wikipedia story, is an example of intellectual yet idiot. I'm working on an opioid recovery project with Patrick Kennedy, for example, who is a recovering addict. And I think that he would share your view. I would also say that the whole criminal justice system and the whole mental health system are 2 of the areas where there are tremendous opportunities to both improve life for people and to save large amounts of money, because the current system in both areas is destructive. It's not. It's misdesigned for reality.
Sure.
I can use that. Okay. 1 or 2 last questions. This lady, you are the last question. I'm now. My leader has now told me.
Rebecca Cooper, I used to cover the Speaker for CNN when he was in charge of Congress, and it was great fun. And now I'm one of those city universities. I'm at American University at the business school, where we're trying to get people to really focus on the issues during this White House. So with all these different things you laid out, what we're asking leaders such as yourself is, how would you prioritize some of the big ticket items for the Trump White House of immigration, healthcare overhaul, infrastructure package, and tax reform and regulatory overhaul? Prioritize those, and then if you would, Mr. Speaker, tell us which of those you actually think a year from now we could come back here and see something having actually gotten all the way through Congress and passed into law.
Well, I mean, my bias would be to say all of them. And the ones you listed are all sort of high priority, and that he ought to try to get a significant part of every one of them through in the next year. I mean, he has to establish momentum and sustain momentum. And those are key areas, partly because some of them are linked together in terms of jobs. Ultimately, the 2 things he'll be measured on more than anything else are we safe, and did we create jobs? If he can answer yes on those 2, he'll get reelected. If he can't, he's got trouble. And if he can answer yes on both those, he'll be in pretty good shape in the 2018 election, which will be the first real referendum. So my view is you have to start from those 2 and say, what is it that will produce those? And then those are the things you've got to focus on and got to solve. He has to focus on immigration, and he has to focus on the wall, because that was the base of his candidacy originally. He has to focus, I think, on infrastructure at a secondary level. Tax reform is much more powerful than infrastructure and creating jobs. And so they're going to have to sort out, and obviously he and the congressional Republicans aren't on the same page right now, so they're going to have to spend some time sorting through and learning how to live with each other to figure out what the right program is. But I do think, on balance, that he has, and he's assembled a team that can do this. I mean, you know, you've got with people like Madison, with Mattis, Kelly, Flynn, and Tillerson, you've got a core group over here. You can say, you know, worry about the world and tell me what's going on. He's got a pretty strong group of winners on economics. People, again, Wilbur Ross, for example, Mnuchin, people who understand the economy, and he can say to them, create jobs, tell me what I need to do. So he can build a couple of pretty aggressive teams that are out there that he can then reinforce and can lead. And I think that's got to be sort of the pattern they build. We'll see what happens. Thank you all very much. We'll be back next week, right? Thank you.